All right, thanks again for joining. We're going to get going now. My name is Colin Murphy. I'm the Deputy Director for the Policy Institute for Energy, Environment, and the Economy at UC Davis. I also co-lead along with Julie Whitcover, who's here with me off camera, the Low Carbon Fuel Policy Research Initiative here at UC Davis. Today we have a webinar. We're presenting on results of our recent modeling on LCFS targets for 2030. I'm also joined by Wook, who's a postdoctoral scholar in our lab. Wook is actually going to start the presentation, then I will take over partway through. We will be circulating these slides to everybody who's registered, so definitely no worries on that. It might be, I think, Monday when they actually go out, because the person with access to the email list is out today. We'll be discussing the publications we expect out of this and ongoing work as we keep going. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Wook to start the presentation. Thanks. Wook.
Hello, my name is Wook, a postdoctoral researcher at UC Davis Policy Institute. And today, next slide, please. So, yeah, before we start, we want to acknowledge Dr. Julie Whitcover, Dr. Dan Mazzoni, Pedro Orozco, and Ray Kang for the help support for this research in the Policy Institute UC Davis. And this project was funded by the ITS Davis STEPS Plus Energy Futures program, and the Driving to Zero study, which will be shown this presentation, was supported by the California Environmental Protection Agencies. Next slide, please. So today I will cover the overview of FPSM and the method in the model, and afterwards Dr. Murphy will present the rest of the material shown in the list, including primary modeling result, additional results for various scenarios, and acceleration mechanisms and conclusions. Next slide, please.
Oh, and one quick thing. So please use the Q&A function to ask any questions. Julie will be moderating those and passing them along. We're going to, if she sees any questions that are immediate clarification, we'll try to take those in the middle. But other than that, we'll be taking some questions and left some time for discussion at the end. Thanks.
Okay, so first, I will introduce the origins of FPSM, Fuel Portfolio Scenario Modeling. The FPSM is built on some previous studies, such as LCFS Illustrative Compliance Scenario Calculator developed by ARB in 2017, California's Clean Fuel Future by Cellulose in 2018, and Driving California's Transportation Emissions to Zero by UC Davis ITS in 2021. And throughout the presentation, this last study will be referred as Driving to Zero or DTG study. So similar to these previous studies, the FPSM does not perform any optimization or statistical simulation, but it allows users to assemble coherent and comprehensive fuel portfolio based on the specified and transparent methods. When developing a fuel portfolio, the FPSM does not consider the credit price or price volatility in the model, but it is still important to estimate credit and deficit generation for each fuel portfolio easily. Stability of credit price depends on how to maintain balance between credit supply and demand, but it is extremely difficult due to the changes in technology or economic and policy conditions. So the model like the FPSM can be an important part of the accurate modeling of LCFS market. Next slide, please. So as mentioned before, the FPSM is built on Driving to Zero study, which has adopted some results from the Transportation Transitions Model, also known as TTM, developed by Drs. Lou Polton, Dr. Marshall Miller, and grad student Qian Wang. The TTM models transitions in the vehicle fleet and changes to vehicle activity based on cost of different vehicles. And based on these, the model provides statewide fuel consumption data at highly aggregated level, which will be shown in the next slide. While the FPSM also uses the results from the TTM as the Driving to Zero study, the TTM results have been updated to reflect some policies such as Advanced Clean Cars 2, ACC2, Advanced Clean Trucks, ACT, and Advanced Clean Fleets, ACF, and also to improve the alignment with the historical fuel consumption data from the LCFS. Next slide, please. So this is an example of TTM result. As you can see here, the TTM provides a highly aggregated vehicle activity data, and then these were converted to fuel consumption data based on the efficiency of each fuel and imported into the FPSM. From the TTM result, the FPSM gets annual fuel consumption projections for 7 categories, including gasoline, gasoline substitutes, diesel, diesel substitutes, electricity, natural gas, and hydrogen. Next slide, please. One advantage of using the FPSM is that the model allows rapid and customized analysis with selections of multiple fuel demand scenarios, which come from the TTM result, and different carbon intensity reduction target trajectories and various control parameter schemes. The general approach in the FPSM is bottom-up approach, which is summing category-specific estimates to develop a fuel portfolio, and then calculating LCFS credits and deficits for each fuel portfolio to assess policy compliance. It aggregates and curates projections of fuel availability where available, and otherwise use linear projection based on historical data. While the users can develop their own alternatives for reduction target or control parameter schemes, the default values in this study mostly obtained from the Driving to Zero study. Next slide, please. So here is a list of parameters which users can modify and adjust for their own alternative scenarios. So there is a lot of material here, but we are not going to cover it in depth here, but the slide will be circulated to the attendees later. So users can create and save multiple control parameter schemes, which include carbon intensity improvement rate, goals and growth rates for each fuel, project and infrastructure credits, blend rates and fractions, and lipid-based fuels capacity. The fundamental approach in these control parameters is using near-term projections where available, and then using simple growth rates thereafter. These are very easy to adjust and change, so it allows users to run different scenarios very quickly. Next slide, please. So based on these assumptions and scenarios, the FPSM calculates consumption of each fuel category as well as the credits and deficits. In this presentation, I will only introduce calculation method briefly, and the detailed method will be described in the report we will be releasing soon. Before calculating each fuel, the first step of the calculation is pre-processing of CARB historical data and TTM results for merging them. The main processing within this step is matching the fuel and vehicle categories between the TTM and the LCFS historical data. And then for gasoline calculation, it starts with dividing the total liquid gasoline substitutes into ethanol and renewable gasoline, because in the TTM, these two are merged as one category. So when doing this, the FPSM assumes a shift to E15 standard in 2031, 200 million gallons per year of drop in renewable gasoline by 2030, and 1 billion gallons per year by 2040. And also 300 million gallons per year of low carbon ethanol, which is cellulosic ore from carbon capture and storage by 2030. And for natural gas calculation, the important feature is separating renewable natural gas into different sources. So for this, the FPSM uses California's population-weighted share of the US national renewable natural gas supply, and then assumes that total demand is satisfied by the lowest carbon intensity sources first, and then moving on to the next available one. Next slide, please. Next, for diesel, liquid diesel substitute, and sustainable aviation fuel, which are lipid-based fuels, the feedstock constraints have been added to avoid renewable diesel runaway. So as a default, it is set at 1.75 billion gallon diesel equivalent total for SAF, renewable diesel and biodiesel. And this can be easily adjusted in the control parameter section as desired. Within this limit, the SAF demand is satisfied first, and then biodiesel blended into the pool is satisfied. And then the remaining capacity is going to renewable diesel, and residual demand is met by the petroleum diesel. With the diesel pool, we want to mention that currently we are assuming no significant deployment of cellulosic diesel or SAF by 2030. For electricity calculation, it requires disaggregating the TTM total electricity into LCFS categories, such as light duty, medium heavy duty, and off-road. And for each grid average electricity or low carbon intensity electricity, and also need to distinguish residential and non-residential use. When calculating for electricity, we assume that low CI electricity is all zero CI, and also the electricity grid will be zero carbon by 2045. Lastly, the FPSM also calculates credits and deficits for hydrogen, project-based credits, direct air capture, carbon capture and storage, incremental crude deficits, etc. And for this, the FPSM assumes that 1 million of total project-based credits are generated in 2030, and existing hydrogen refueling infrastructure and fast charging infrastructure protocols will hit 2.5 cap, but not renewed or expanded. So this is an example output you can get from the FPSM. So these are the figures showing a total energy consumption of gasoline pool and diesel pool. And you can see that the FPSM generates disaggregated fuel portfolios for both pools. So in this figure, you can see the declining trend of energy consumption due to the shift to high efficiency vehicles like EV or fuel cell vehicles. Next slide, please. And also, the FPSM provides credits and deficit generation figures by fuel type and the cumulative bank when net credit balance is not zero. So based on these figures, users can estimate the LCFS compliance based on diverse scenarios and assumptions. In addition to that, we want to mention that although the FPSM is able to extend through 2050, but it must be considered to have high uncertainties, especially with the post-2035 result. And thank you for listening, and I will hand it over to Dr. Murphy for the rest of the presentation.
Great, thank you, Wook. So I wanted to give a couple of final thoughts on the methods before we start getting into the results and talking about what we have seen in terms of 2030 targets in California's LCFS. So the FPSM, it projects credit and deficit generation, and we use those projections to estimate credit balance. Like Wook said, we are not attempting to simulate market response to changes in there. We're actually working on a different model that will have sort of market responsive elements. That has a paper under review right now, so stay tuned and you'll hear more about it. This is a more sort of simple scenario analysis and calculation tool. Similarly, we're not attempting to infer future LCFS credit prices based off of this. Those are obviously subject to a lot of very complex factors. And this tool is just not really suited to try to make that sort of estimation. We're very confident in the ability of FPSM to provide useful policy guidance out through about 2035, though we definitely note that useful policy guidance does not mean quantitatively accurate predictions. There's always going to be a lot of uncertainty in the market. And as Wook said, the LCFS market is going to be completely different after somewhere in the mid-2030s, because at that point, the fuel pool is about equal parts petroleum and non-petroleum, and so the revenue dynamics that have dominated the LCFS to date will be completely different. No model exists that I think I have any confidence in its ability to predict what the market's going to look like after 2035. So that's sort of really where we have confidence in the ability to gain useful policy guidance is sort of through the early to mid 2030s. So as we talk about the results, we're really going to be talking about two scenarios of interest. One is what we call the low carbon transition scenario, or abbreviated LCT. And this is the one that Wook talked about, where we use the most recent runs from the TTM model to provide the most recent estimates of baseline transportation fuel demand. It includes all historical LCFS data through 2022, and assumes things like the Advanced Clean Cars 2, Advanced Clean Trucks, and Advanced Clean Fleets are fully implemented. We also are going to present a number of results based off of the scenarios we did for the Driving to Zero report. And so this is not as recently updated. This is coming from TTM runs that were done in 2020 when we were doing the modeling for Driving to Zero. And so what this means is it doesn't include any of the effects that COVID had on transportation activity, as well as it included kind of preliminary estimates of what ACC2, ACT, and ACF would look like. They ended up being relatively close, but I'll explain why we're still interested in this older scenario in just a moment. We did also calculate sort of business as usual scenario that assumed that the more recent fleet policies were not fully implemented. We're not presenting the results here because we don't think there's a lot of real sort of relevant policy guidance there. There was also a high fuel cell scenario run through TTM for a different project. We're not presenting it here because there's really not a whole lot of difference between the high fuel cell scenario and the LCT scenario through 2030. This greater level of fuel cell penetration really starts to make an impact there. So just for the sake of brevity, we're not really talking about it. The reason why we want to actually still keep presenting the Driving to Zero scenario, even though it is based on somewhat older data, is because since the modeling in it was done before COVID, it essentially assumes a baseline trajectory in which transportation activity rebounds to its pre-COVID level fully. Whereas the LCT scenario, because it was sort of rebaselined off of 2021 and 2022 data, it's caught part of the COVID rebound, but it does infer a somewhat lower kind of structural level of gasoline consumption. Now, if that lower level continues because people continue teleworking and there's less gasoline demand, then it may be more accurate. But I think what this does is, while we didn't set out to do a kind of a low gasoline demand and a high gasoline demand scenario when we ran these two, it ends up giving us that. And given that the LCFS market and credit balance is very sensitive to the total amount of driving, it ends up being a very useful scenario to do these kind of low demand and high demand comparisons. There are some other differences between LCT and DTZ. They tend to be relatively small. They're kind of, sort of lost in the wash or smaller than the inherent uncertainty in the model. So really these two scenarios are largely pretty equivalent, except for the fundamental gasoline demand. So we looked at a number of target trajectories because we anticipate the LCFS rulemaking opening up sometime in the next few months, and adjusting the target upwards has been clearly identified by CARB as the primary thing that they want to do in this 2023 rulemaking. In previous pre-rulemaking workshops, CARB expressed interest in 25, 30, and 35% as potential 2030 program targets. So we used those to kind of bound the range of targets we looked at. We also looked at some intermediate values, a 27.5 and a 32.5% target. And we also looked at a front-loaded 30% target. And we'll get a little bit into more depth about what exactly that means. But it's basically bringing the ambition on a bit sooner, but ending up at a 30% target in 2030, just like the kind of more standard. In all of these, the target trajectories are not perfectly linear. Part of this is because we wanted to keep things in round quarters of a percent, and also try to sort of match the target acceleration to the underlying market. They're relatively close to linear, but certainly not perfectly so. I do want to call everyone's attention to the period from 2031 to 2035, so the 5 years after the 2030 target. And one of the things that has been apparent in all of the FPSM modeling we've done is that you have to have very rapid increases in the target after 2030 to account for the fact that at this point, after 2030, ZEV sales fractions in California, mostly going to be electric vehicles, are getting very close to 100. So you have a very rapid influx of EVs into the fleet, which reduces gasoline demand and brings in a lot more credits, as well as a rapid retirement of gasoline vehicles, which reduces the amount of deficits. So in order to account for that and not have the market become oversupplied with credits and have another credit price collapse, you have to have something like 5 to 6% per year target increases in this period in order to prevent that runaway. So in order to really let this presentation focus on, on target impacts up to 2030, we made the same assumption for all of the scenarios of a 6% per year target increase after 2030. There is a slide where we'll start getting a little more depth into some of the differences in post-2030 targets. But we did really want to identify that under every scenario, if California is going to come anywhere close to meeting its EV deployment goals, you have to have extremely rapid target accelerations for a period in the early 2030s. So here are some of the results that we're doing. And so these graphs, the top graph is the credit balance. So the total deficit or surplus in a year-on-year basis. And the bottom is the credit bank. And we're looking at really that full range of targets that we put up. So starting from the top, the red and the gray lines, the 25 and the 27.5%, both of those continue having very significant credit surpluses year on year through the 2030s. And so as you see in the bottom, the bank keeps growing. What this means, they don't do enough to really bring the market back into balance. They're probably not going to do enough to prop up the LCFS credit price and achieve the goals CARB has to support investments in critical technologies. So at least for the LCT scenario, the 25 and 27.5 look too low. The 30% target on the more linear approach, which is the yellow line, also maintains pretty significant credit surpluses year on year, about 5 million per year. But the front-loaded 30%, where you bring on the ambition a little bit earlier in the process, does actually get you much down closer to a balanced market through most of the 2020s, though, because it has to come back up and sort of get back to a 30% target, that it does see some surpluses at the end of the decade. But so the additional front-loading of ambition that we see in the 30% front-loaded trajectory does seem to make a meaningful difference and come a lot closer to achieving the goals that CARB looked at. In the LCT scenario, things like the 32.5 or the 35% scenario, so the dark blue and the green lines, those get you to an approximately balanced market through most of the 2020s. The 35% scenario, though, once you get to the end of the 2020s into the 2030s, you rapidly start accumulating deficits and you deplete the bank pretty quickly. So I think what this says is the 35% target is too ambitious and is likely to lead to a drawdown of the bank in ways that we don't want to see. So, the takeaway from these slides is, at least under the LCT scenario, and again, there's a number of assumptions built into the LCT scenario, but under that scenario, I think we're really looking at sort of the 27.5 to 32.5% range of targets, more so in the upper end of those as what's needed to bring the market back into balance. This is a snapshot of where credits in the LCFS market are going to be coming from in 2030. So on the left column, it shows you the total number of LCFS credits being generated by those categories, and the right shows the total volume of fuels coming in gasoline and diesel equivalents. What we see is that light-duty electric vehicles generate about 40% of the total credits in the market. Medium and heavy-duty is another 10%. And then non-road, so things like rail and cargo handling equipment and forklifts and ETRUs are another 5% or so. So you're getting certainly more than half of the total credits in the market come from electric vehicles after 2030. Liquid diesel substitutes, the biodiesel and renewable diesel, supply about 15%, and renewable gas supplies about 15%. So between electric transportation and renewable natural gas and diesel, you're getting a bit over 80% of the total credit in the market. The other things, liquid gasoline substitutes, ethanol, hydrogen, aviation fuels projects, those sort of supply the residual. But it definitely shows that, by the later part of this decade, the LCFS, the vast majority of support is going to be going to electric vehicles. So this is drilling a little bit deeper into the LCT and the DTZ scenarios. And again, I think the difference is the LCT is sort of the more optimistic, lower gasoline consumption scenario, and the driving to zero is sort of a higher gasoline consumption scenario. And one of the things that we're seeing is that in 2030, the difference between these two is at least in terms of its effect on the credit bank, is about 2.5% of program of target stringency, roughly. And so what we see here is the red line shows the 27.5% target. Solid lines are for the LCT. Dashed lines are for driving to zero. Under the 27.5 target, under LCT, you see really strong surpluses year on year, and even under the kind of more pessimistic driving to zero, there's still surpluses, and the bank still grows. So this sort of shows that 27.5 is probably a little low, even under the somewhat more pessimistic assumptions. The 30%, the yellow lines, under the LCT, you're still getting some credit growth year on year, but under the driving to zero scenario, you're getting approximately 2 balance. And this is the regular 30, not the front loaded 30. And under the 32.5% target, under the LCT, you have a pretty solid market balance through, but under the driving to zero, you go into deficit pretty quickly and you deplete the bank. And so I think what this says is, certainly within the range of outcomes that we think are likely, even, the 32.5% is probably pushing ambition a bit more than we want. And there's certainly a lot of risk of persistent deficits there. But even under the more kind of pessimistic scenario, the 27.5 appears too low and likely to continue building up significant credit balances and potentially not propping up the credit price in the way that CARB is hoping to see right now. This slide gets into a closer examination of front loading by looking at just the 30% and then the front load 30% target. And that table at the bottom shows the year-on-year targets. And it's really not a huge difference. The biggest gap between them is in 2026, when the front loaded trajectory is 2 percentage points higher than the standard trajectory. And then it kind of, there's catch up after that. But even with this relatively modest front loading of the total target ambition, you get about 12 million additional deficits coming into the system in the front loaded scenario as compared to the sort of baseline 30% scenario. And so so that likely translates into 12 million lower bank release. That's the way FPSM handles it. But it does show that there is kind of a meaningful difference in that the timing of target ambition matters, and that you can make a kind of significant difference in the market balance and the credit and deficit supply simply by changing when you bring in ambition in the various years that you have options. And also shows that there's a relatively high sensitivity sensitive to relatively small changes, that even though, again, the difference maxed out at 2%, you did get these 12 million additional deficits coming in under the front loaded scenario. So this slide looks at the differences in target trajectories after 2030. So we ran kind of the 27, the 30 front loaded, and the 32.5% scenarios with a 5% per year post 2030 target acceleration and a 6% per year post 2030 target acceleration, to just get a sense of the difference between these trajectories. And again, it's only 1% per year change in ambition. So on the credit balance graph on the top, all of the lines that are closer to horizontal, those are the 5% targets, and the lines that are sloping downwards are the 6% targets. But I think the implication here is a lot more apparent by looking at the banked credits. And I think what we take away from this is, if you have a lot of ambition early on in the program, so if you're on the more ambitious, like the 32.5% 2030 target, so those are the green and blue lines at the bottom. If you have a lot of ambition early on in the program, then the 6% post 2030 targets drive you into deficits and are likely to deplete the bank. Whereas if you have somewhat less ambition early on and are on the 27.5 or the 30% targets up through 2030, then there's more room to have ambition later in the program, and the program can handle the 6% per year target increases after 2030. And so I think, again, this sort of reinforces the message that there is some flexibility to decide, do we want to bring on ambition sooner or later in the LCFS in order to make sure that it achieves our long-term goals. And the reason why the timing of ambition matters is because I think we have to consider the potential retail gasoline cost impact. So I ran some kind of straw man numbers here. These are looking at the per gallon cost impacts, the sort of amount that the LCFS would apply due to deficits on the gasoline part of the gallon, at various target levels from 30% to 60%. So again, these are the kinds of target levels that we are going to have to get to in the 2030 to 2035 time period in order to keep the market approximately in balance. And we're looking at the cost impacts with different assumptions about what the LCFS credit price could be, from $50 to $150. And these are all in static 2022 dollars, so not attempting to adjust for inflation here. So what we're seeing is the LCFS could, under some circumstances, certainly at the higher target levels, be getting into some pretty significant, per gallon cost impacts. Now, I don't know if there's a line in the sand somewhere of what is acceptable in a political or equity or economic sense, but certainly I think some of these per gallon cost impacts are enough to give us pause, especially when you consider the table that's on the bottom of the slide. And what this table shows is the fraction of gasoline internal combustion engine vehicles in the light duty vehicle fleet. And so remember, this is all in the LCT scenario. It is assuming that California, the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule is deployed, fully implemented, and successfully met. So by 2035, we are selling no more internal combustion engine, or we're registering no new internal combustion engine vehicles. So while we are seeing very rapid turnover to a ZEV-dominated fleet, primarily EVs, in 2035, at least in this model, about half the people are still driving internal combustion engine vehicles. And our expectation is that the transition from internal combustion engine vehicles to ZEVs, primarily EVs, is going to happen quicker at the upper ends of the income spectrum, right? That more affluent people are going to be more likely to buy an EV sooner, in part because almost all the new cars in California are bought by people in the upper half of the income bracket. And so if this transition, sort of follows that expectation, and people who are lower income tend to be later to be able to transition to an EV, that means that the lower part of the income bracket is going to be sort of more strongly exposed to these gasoline price increases due to the escalating LCFS target. Now, I want to be clear, the value of the LCFS and the benefit it provides outweigh the cost. That is a sort of a necessary part of the transition to sustainable transportation, and the value of stable climate and clean air greatly outweigh this. But given that there is some flexibility to decide whether we want to have ambition early or later in the program, I think this argues for delaying the ambition a bit and trying to wait so the transition to EVs has progressed further, so fewer people are exposed to these gasoline price increases. I think this also really underscores the critical necessity of efforts that the state has started to provide alternatives to gasoline internal combustion engines aimed at lower income people. So things like the MioCar program, which is a shared electric mobility pilot program operating in several cities in the Valley. We have numerous investments in transit and active mobility aimed at lower income communities. And we also have a lot of programs out there to provide additional financial incentives to bring EVs into lower income communities. I think that is going to be absolutely critical to reinforce those efforts and to make sure that they succeed, to try to make sure that, as the potential gas price increases get higher, the people who are exposed to them are there because they choose to, because they find either particular value in having internal combustion engine, or maybe they have ideological reasons. And so I think we want to, the delaying the transition mitigates some of the risk of a particularly regressive impact. The other thing that really comes into a lot of these discussions is based off of work that we published as a technical report in December. The links in these slides are live. Again, we'll be sending them out to all the registered attendees probably early next week. So you'll be able to find and get it into more depth. And this is sort of a challenge that we've discovered in doing some of our modeling work here. And that is that the way the LCFS currently calculates credit generation for vehicles that have an energy economy ratio greater than 1, so vehicles that are like electric vehicles or hydrogen fuel cells, the current calculation method sort of assumes that because they're more efficient, for every unit of energy that is given to these vehicles as fuel, a specified amount set by the ratio, the energy economy ratio of conventional fuels displaced. So for light duty electric vehicles, that EER, the energy economy ratio, is 3.4. So it basically means the program assumes that for every megajoule of electricity you give to an EV, 3.4 megajoules of gasoline are not consumed. Now, early in the transition, where we are to date, where the fleet is overwhelmingly dominated by gasoline vehicles, this is a perfectly reasonable assumption to make, right? Today, if somebody is driving an EV, if they weren't driving an EV, there's a very good chance that that travel would happen in a gasoline vehicle. So right now, this isn't really a problem. But as you get further through the transition, once you get to a point where electric vehicles become a significant fraction of the fleet, that assumption that if you weren't fueling an electric vehicle, you'd be fueling a gasoline vehicle instead doesn't work, right? If the fleet is half electric and half gasoline, there's a decent chance that the alternative, if somebody wasn't driving an electric vehicle, would be to drive a different electric vehicle. Because at that point, you have some electric vehicles that are starting to exit the fleet because they've aged out or because of accidents, and you have used vehicle effects. And so the assumption becomes less and less reasonable the further you progress through the transition to EVs. And what it means is you are structurally and systematically overestimating the amount of fossil fuel displacement that EVs and other advanced technology vehicles, so really EVs and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, you are overestimating their displacement of fossil fuels. And so this matters quite a bit. So if we look at in 2030, in the LCT scenario, under a 30% target, the credits given to light duty EVs for just the basic credits for charging at grid average carbon intensity, light duty EVs get about 15.5 million credits. And of those, about 13.7 million of them are due to this assumed displacement. So we know in 2030, if we're on a trajectory something like this, about 20% of the fleet is going to be EV. So that means some significant fraction, less than 20%, but some significant fraction of those 13.7 million credits are going to be given for displacement that isn't actually occurring. And so I think if we are concerned about the really high targets we need causing gas price impacts, one of the ways to address this would be stop giving credits for displacement that is not in fact occurring. And so in this paper that's linked there, there's I proposed a method where you modify the existing equation, basically algebraically rearrange it, add one additional variable to allow a different assumption about displacement, and it gives a way to that makes the assumption on displacement provides ways for CARB to do it in a more accurate way moving forward, in a more flexible way, and also deals with the sort of market balance problems of electric vehicles eventually flooding too many credits into the market, which we discovered and discussed a lot in the Driving to Zero report, and the current modeling says is still likely to happen. For those of you who have been attending, our LCFS modeling workshops in the past, for much of the last couple of years, we've been talking about 5 key areas of uncertainty that need to be kind of understood and that affect the ability of CARB to set targets. These are all still largely very applicable. Things like the in-state EV deployment rates. It's going to require a real expansion of the pipeline of electric vehicles onto the market, and resolution of things like critical mineral shortages and battery manufacturing shortages. The Inflation Reduction Act at the federal level certainly helped with this. So we're on a good trajectory so far, but we don't want to assume success. And so there's some uncertainty around, will there be enough EVs to allow ACC2 to be met in the way that we are projecting? And then we also don't know whether EVs are going to what's going to happen after the first vehicle sells them. And there's some evidence that a number of states are systematically buying used EVs from California as a way to bring low-cost electric mobility into their state. We also don't know if people are going to be bringing out-of-state internal combustion engine vehicles in to try to find ways around the sort of end of new internal combustion registrations. And all of those could affect the sort of balance of energy consumption that really determines the LCFS credit balance. VMT and fuel consumption trends are as always an area of uncertainty. We don't really know if the rebound from COVID and driving behavior has completed. There's certainly arguments to be made that more people are teleworking, and so you would expect to see reduced commuting. But if you look at the fourth quarter fuel consumption data in California combined with some of the CEC data, there's evidence that the gasoline market is continuing to rebound, and that something like the Driving to Zero scenario may actually be a better estimate of long-run gasoline consumption trends. And so plus there's the evergreen question of, can California eventually have VMT per person stop growing? We've had a number of policies that have attempted, but so far they haven't really gotten there. There's a lot of uncertainty around the carbon intensity of things like renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel. These are fuels made from lipids, things like waste oils, used cooking oils, or tallow, or corn or soybean oil. Right now, California has been able to sort of take the primary position and claim dibs on most of the really low carbon feedstock, because we've had historically, the largest market and a strong LCFS credit price. But with a number of jurisdictions adopting LCFS programs, we don't know if California is going to be able to maintain that position. We do know that most of the growth in these lipids is going to come from crop oils. But if we lose the ability to keep competing for the low carbon stuff, there'll be more crop oils coming in, and the carbon intensity of these fuels, which again are 15% of the pool in 2030 and a larger percent right now, that carbon intensity goes up and they can generate fewer credits. So there's a significant amount of uncertainty there. There's a lot of questions on project-based credits. The infrastructure capacity credits have not been performing as well as we thought. They're, the hydrogen one is at about half of its cap. The DC fast charging is maybe 30% of its cap. So they're sort of underperforming. All the other project-based credits, things like refinery investments, renewable hydrogen, innovative crude, there's been almost no activity in them. And so we don't know if that's going to continue or if they will eventually start picking up. And then finally, we know that there's been a lot of calls for CARB to significantly change the way that renewable natural gas is credited under the LCFS. CARB has, proposed a couple of very small changes, but most of those are not really going to make a big difference. Certainly not within the 2030 time period. They do change the carbon intensity in out years. But if CARB takes more significant action, it's likely to reduce the number of credits from the space, and that will have impacts on the balance. Now, I think the modeling that we're showing here is, even though RNG is 15% of the market, the market can almost certainly hit a 30% target, even if the growth in renewable natural gas is limited by future CARB action. But exactly what that's going to mean, we need to have sort of better clarity on what's likely to happen, and there is uncertainty there. So a few kind of like final thoughts and before a quick discussion of acceleration mechanisms. And so I think one of the things that we've discovered is that the market in the structural credit balance is relatively sensitive to kind of small changes in the total target. And while some of those changes will kind of be adapted by normal market response, the value of having a market is you have this natural sort of buffer that can adapt to fluctuations. Getting the target setting exercise right is actually very important, and you've got to get it right in a fairly precise way. At least that's what the modeling shows. Now, one of the things we know is, at least at the national level, there's certainly a lot of potential for more soybean oil-based lipid-based fuels to come into California, and those are, generally speaking, cleaner than petroleum. Maybe not a lot cleaner, but they at least provide some value. So you could potentially push a higher target that would require accepting a lot more crop-based diesel substitutes coming in, and sort of growing those, the consumption of those in California at the maximum possible rate. And there's no question, is that an outcome that we really want, given that they present a number of sustainability and land use change concerns? So the modeling that we did used a sort of a cap on the total amount of lipids in order to kind of prevent that runaway from happening. And there's a question of, will a similar cap be put in place by CARB moving forward? And the last thing, and this is sort of more of a meta point, is all of this modeling is extremely complex. Like the FPSM is standing on the shoulders of the work we did in Driving to Zero, and that's standing on the shoulders of the work that Chris Malins and Serology did in Clean Fuel Future, and that's standing ultimately on the shoulders of the work that CARB did back in 2017 around the illustrative compliance scenario calculator. And it has taken a lot of work to keep this model evolving and make it able to go and give us even the sort of modest level of insight that it can do right now. You have to keep putting this work in to keep the model able to provide policy guidance. And this is going to be a challenge because the work that we're presenting here is mostly done with one-time funds. It was, the Driving to Zero report was a specific grant to do one report. We used funds from the Resilient and Innovative Mobility Initiative, RIMI, which is a one-time state allocation for the purpose. Steps Plus does provide some ongoing funding, but it's has to cover a lot of topics. So right now, we don't have resources to keep kind of the pace of development and the pace of evolution in the modeling capacity up for the next several years in the way we have over the last few. And perhaps this is a self-serving point, but I think that's going to become a problem. And I think we need to keep investing in the research and modeling on these topics to let us make good science-informed decisions here. I wanted to give a couple quick thoughts on the auto adjustment mechanism, though the next couple slides we did present at the CARB auto adjustment mechanism workshop about 5 or 6 weeks ago, so you can find a more in-depth treatment of it there. But we looked at a number of acceleration mechanism scenarios, and so the idea of an auto acceleration mechanism is create a certain set of conditions, certain, if the number of credits, if the growth in the credit bank exceeds a certain threshold, trigger a mechanism that adds increases future targets in order to compensate. This is sort of a mechanism to automatically account for oversupply of credits and prevent us from having a repeat of where we are right now, where the credit price is artificially depressed. We looked at several different mechanisms for how this acceleration mechanism could look. We used the 27.5% LCT scenario as our baseline. We wanted to pick a scenario that was structurally oversupplied because that's kind of the world that mechanism would work in. We looked at just front loading the ambition. We looked at what's called a pull forward, and this is where when the mechanism is triggered at January 1st in the following year, instead of moving forward 1 year on the LCFS target trajectory, you move forward 2 years, and you sort of increase the target by 2 years worth in order to increase the ambition in future years and start to soak up some of those excess credits. This can be done in a permanent way, right, where you just jump forward 2 years and then stay on this new trajectory, only now a year ahead of schedule, or it can be temporary, where you jump forward 2 years and then you hold there for a year and you get back on the original trajectory. We also looked at mechanisms where you just add a single percentage point to every future year of the LCFS target. Also, when we added 2 percentage points, and then finally we looked at a mechanism that we call trigger and release, and this is the pull forward mechanism where you jump forward 2 years in the target, and then it maintains at that more rapid level until the market goes into deficit for a year, right? Until it shows that now there's not enough credits. And then when that deficit happens, it relaxes and you hold that target for an additional year and you get back on the original trajectory. So in all of these, apart from the one spot necessitated by the functioning of the trigger and release mechanism, we also maintain the 6% per year target increases across all others. And so again, we have a graph with the credit year-on-year balances on top and the total bank on the bottom. I think in this case, actually, the table in the lower right, which shows the total size of the bank in 2030 and 2035, as long as the delta, the difference between the bank in that year in that scenario and the baseline, I think that in some ways actually shows a little more of the depth and the difference between these two mechanisms. So I think what we see is things like the front loading or the 1 year temporary pull forward. Those certainly can take a few million credits out of the system, but given the size of the overshoot, or at least the potential overshoot in some of these, that might not be enough. The 1% adder and the 2% adder, both take out a significant chunk, and they keep adding a little bit of incremental ambition going forward. And the trigger and release mechanism, I think, actually looks pretty good as an alternative based off of this. So again, that's sort of my opinion, in that it gives a pretty significant quick hit to increase the amount of deficits generated, and so it does a pretty rapid impact and provides a lot of near-term benefit. And then the problem with the permanent pull forwards is, like I mentioned, you have to have very rapid target accelerations after 2030 or so. And so when you pull forward the entire compliance schedule by a year, what happens is you pull some of those years of very rapid acceleration into years when basically the market's not ready for it, right? Pull it into years where before you have high enough EV sales rates to really justify that level of target. And because you're pulling forward not only the first year, but all the subsequent years, you're sort of getting out over your skis a bit, and eventually the permanent pull forward takes out a lot of credits and puts the market on a trajectory towards depleting the bank. So the permanent pull forward seems dangerous. Trigger and release mechanism lets you get that sort of big near-term impact with a mechanism to automatically relax back to the initial trajectory once it starts looking have exceeded what the market can provide. So I think what this shows is, there's a number of different mechanisms that all potentially have value. I do think the permanent pull forward is quite risky. I would have a lot of qualms about adopting that. But depending on the size of the intervention you want, all of the other mechanisms potentially can provide value here. So here are sort of the conclusions before we get to Q&A. And so, at least in terms of the model, we think the FPSM allows for a relatively granular, certainly not dynamic, there's no market response, but a relatively granular projection of fuel portfolios and LCFS compliance. And we think that the LCT scenario and the earlier driving to zero scenario are useful scenarios to help us explore different targets under a range of uncertainty, particularly about the amount of gasoline consumption that's likely to happen. That we see that by 2030, electric vehicles, including light duty, heavy duty, and off-road, the total electric vehicle pool generates more than half of the LCFS credits by 2030, and even gets to become the overwhelming majority as you get further in the 2030s. Lipid diesel substitutes and RNG are about 15% each, and then everything else is sort of that last 20%. Hydrogen and gasoline and drop in gasoline generate a little less than 20% or 10% 2030 credits, but they become a lot more important in 2035 and beyond. So really for them, it's not so much you need them for 2030 compliance, but they have to be moving in the right direction if they're going to reach the volumes necessary for long run compliance. I think what this round of modeling shows is that the 25% target is not high enough to address the structural oversupply of credits. So it's not really going to do what CARB really wants it to do. But the 35% target is probably too high, and then it's likely to lead to persistent deficits and deplete the bank before 2035. So based on that, the 30% kind of plus or minus 2.5% range appears to be really sort of where we want to be focusing on when we talk about what the 2030 target should be. Now, it is really important to note that a lot of the other programmatic changes that CARB is considering, things like adding additional capacity credits or adding a really significant crop-based feedstock cap, those will impact the number of credits that can be generated. We can certainly run scenarios that have those, but these central scenarios we focused on today don't have those additional changes in there. I also wanted to give some of sort of my opinions. This is inferring based on the work here as well as other things. You'll note I took the logo off to reinforce the fact this is no longer sort of what FPSM is telling you, but it's what me as the person who kind of worked in FPSM quite a bit and spends a lot of time looking at stuff thinking. So I think the LCT scenario is probably erring on the side of being a touch optimistic. I don't think we're going to see a rebound to exactly pre-COVID levels of driving. I do think the fourth quarter data is indicative that there is still some rebound in driving activity to happen. And so I think I wouldn't use the LCT by itself as the guide for what we're likely to see. There's also a number of ways in which even if ACC2 is implemented, generally well, there's going to be hiccups. There's a number of ways that the actual EV fleet and activity may lag what our models say. I think that I think the truth and what we're looking at is probably something in between the LCT and driving to zero scenarios. I think that we do need to be really concerned about gas costs moving forward as we get to these higher target levels. They've been low to date in the LCFS, but that's not always going to be the case as the target goes up. To be clear, the benefits are absolutely worth it. I'm not trying to be negative. I still think the LCFS is an incredibly important tool in the state's portfolio to reduce the emissions of transportation, but we do need to take the risk of regressive impact seriously. And because of that, I think in this case, it's probably appropriate to think about how long can we delay the ambition in order to let the fleet get further along in its progress towards displacing internal combustion engines and replacing them with EVs. And this is weird for me to say because I've been, before I came back to UC Davis, I worked for a climate advocacy group. There are comment letters with my name on them at CARB and at CEC and in the legislature, going back as much as 10 years, arguing for more ambition. So it feels a little weird for me to be in the position now saying, okay, guys, maybe we need to tap the brakes a bit. But this is what I'm reading out of the data is the question should not be how much ambition can we get? It's what's sort of the minimum ambition we need to keep the market balanced in order to avoid the risk of regressive impacts. I do think that the problem of the overestimation of fuel displacement by EVs and fuel cell vehicles is a real issue. It's not a big problem now, but it will be a big problem in 10 years, 15, 20 years, and certainly more. And one of the ways we can reduce those potentially regressive impacts is to stop giving credits for displacement that isn't occurring. It also deals with problems like the e-forklifts. Like right now, e-forklifts are generating 7% of LCFS credits, but they consume less than 0.5% of total fuel in the California transportation system. This is because of that structural overestimate and the fact that e-forklifts have already largely flipped over to EVs. So I think that we need to address this, and if we address it now, it's relatively small. I think there are a number of critical issues the LCFS needs to address as well. Things like the indirect land use change values and the energy economy ratio values. The EERs were adopted when the program was first adopted. They're based on data that's 15 years old or so. They're out of date, and I think they probably need to be adjusted. They're not radically wrong, but they're still ballpark accurate. But we do need to at least address that. The indirect land use change values are they were reviewed more recently, but I still think there's a lot of change happening in that space, and I think we need to address those. I think also we need to think about new ways of considering additionality in the life cycle assessment, and also we need to be talking about 2035 targets as soon as we can, because fuel project developers need a very long lead time in order to plan, permit, finance, bring a facility into operation, and then actually gain benefit from the incentives that LCFS provides. So there's a lot of this stuff that we should be addressing as soon as possible. Now, CARB has said that they're in the 2023 rulemaking, they're only going to be talking about 2030 targets and auto adjustment mechanisms and a couple of other things, additional infrastructure capacity and maybe some changes to RNG. And I can understand their reasoning. There is a crisis in the market right now, and so putting the fire out first makes sense. But there are these bigger structural issues that if we don't address them soon, then I think they're likely to become fires of their own. And so we can address them before they become problems, or we can address them after. So we should be trying to do them now. So if this decision were mine, if I sort of had the magic wand, I would pick something like our front-loaded 30% target trajectory for the LCFS with the trigger and relax auto adjustment mechanism. And I would put a cap on crop-based feedstocks in order to mitigate the risk that you just bring a lot of soybean oil fuels into California. But I think it's really important that in addition to doing this, they announce that there's going to be another rulemaking as soon as possible, 2024, 2025, as soon as their administrative and modeling and analytical staff can handle it, a new rulemaking to deal with these bigger structural issues on ILUC and EERs and additionality and all these other things to solve these problems before they become crises of their own. So finally, a few next steps. Like I said, the slides will be circulated to the registration list, and we'll also post them on our website, which is right there. So you can get those very shortly. We are finalizing a report. We'll be published as an ITS technical report. It will be published and circulated shortly. Probably it's not going to get out until after the Asilomar conference next week, but hopefully not too long after that. We will submit it for peer-reviewed publication, but we wanted to get it published and out into the community without having to wait on peer review. So that'll be coming out shortly. We do have the ability to do scenario analysis. Wook showed you the slide of control parameters. It is very quick for us to go and make adjustments to those control parameters and to target trajectories and put out new scenarios based on that. And we have this idea that we might be able to very quickly do additional scenarios and then publish them on our website in a way that they are public and transparent and could be cited in future models. So I'm certainly not committed to doing an infinite number of those, but if there's interest, look through those control parameters, and you can send us sort of thoughts on different scenarios. And as long as we only have to adjust the control parameters, it's really quick. We have to do things that are not in the control parameters, and we have to start recoding the model, and then we come into bandwidth limits. And finally, the LCFS rulemaking is going to open soon. We will be participating actively. I highly hope that all of you choose to do the same. Here's our contact information. We are always happy to have ongoing discussions. This is a living model and a topic that's going to move forward quite a bit. And with that, I will turn it over to Julie Whitcover, who's going to sort of manage the Q&A portion of this. I think we're going to start by going through the Q&A that's in the Q&A form. If there's time after that, we may try doing a few verbal questions, but I think there's enough questions here to keep us busy for a bit.
And there's one in the chat also.
And one in the chat.
Yeah. So I'm just going to take care of the one in the chat first, since it was the first one coming in. And it's from Jane O'Malley. and she asks about the cellulosic SAF deployment assumptions, citing Fulcrum Bioenergy and its MSW gasification facility and 2 billion gallons in offtake agreements for cellulosic SAF. She's wondering if you've considered more aggressive deployment scenario for this pathway, especially given the IRA and the LCFS credit incentives and the fact that it's lower cost than some of the other cellulosic technologies.
So that's a very good question, and that's one of the areas where we really want to take a deeper look into and do some technology projections on the cellulosic technologies. So certainly, we hope Fulcrum succeeds because it certainly makes the job of decarbonizing transportation a lot easier. The challenge is they, as far as I know, they haven't hit even kind of their nameplate capacity in production yet. There were some issues when they first commissioned that there was a breakdown in one of their pieces of equipment, and then COVID-related supply chain problems delayed the repair. So, it's possible my understanding might be a little out of date, but they're still struggling to kind of achieve their nameplate capacity. And we've seen this all through the cellulosic fuel space. There were the hydrolysis and fermentation projects in Iowa that spun up and started working, but never managed to really go anywhere. So we wanted to limit the amount to which we were assuming the solution. And we kind of had to do that with drop-in gasoline because there was just no pathway to get to carbon neutrality and for the driving to zero work without drop-in gasoline. So we sort of still have that in there as at least a marker for need. Certainly, if Fulcrum comes online, that would provide some additional relatively low carbon fuel that would reduce the pressure on kind of the crop-based and lipid fuel stocks. But in our model, we're assuming that we're supplying the amount of aviation fuel needed for intrastate aviation, which is about 475 million gallons of jet fuel a year in 2030, based off of the existing kind of lipid projects. But California consumes about 4 billion gallons a year for interstate and international flights. And so there's a lot of demand out there that cellulosic might end up sort of fitting into. So we are certainly open to the idea of doing those scenarios. In the amounts that are likely we think they're likely to materialize by 2030, they wouldn't move the needle a lot. But if they do start materializing in, the few hundreds of millions of gallons by 2030, that makes it much more likely they'll come into really significant levels in the 2030s and beyond. And then when we start talking about 2035 targets, that's where having a better understanding of that becomes a lot more important.
Okay. There's a question from Steve Kafka, and I think you touched on it in some of your uncertainties, but did the modelers assume the public will accept ambitious policy design to force EV adoption? So,
I don't think the public knows about the LCFS for the most part. I mean, it is a complex policy. It is not sort of one of the frontline headline things that command a lot of public attention. A lot of what the public knows about the LCFS comes really from oil company attack ads when the oil companies were really trying to kill the LCFS, as they were in most of the 2010s. So I do think that there is a level at which, if gas prices get too high and the policy impacts are really the reason behind that, then yes, I do think there comes a point when the price impacts do get too high. And that's sort of what I was trying to talk about in the price slide. I don't know where that line is. There is also, the potential that by 2030, as petroleum gasoline demand declines, the fundamental price of petroleum gasoline will decline as well. So if because of declining demand, the price for petroleum fuels declines, that sort of creates space for the policy mechanisms to be able to have a higher impact without increasing the sort of total impact to personal budgets. So I don't have a particularly, definitive answer on that question, but I do think it's something we have to be careful about. And this is why I think in this case, we should be trying to think about how can we delay the ambition a bit in order to let the EV transition progress further.
Okay, we have several questions from Cato Sanford. I'm going to pick one of them and then we can circle back to the others if time allows. This one is kind of long, and it's about sort of modeling strategy and concept and assumptions. And I'll just read it because it is complicated. You said at one point that delaying ambition is better as it softens the blow on fuel prices for those in lower income brackets. But surely if you were using the same trajectory of vehicle sales and other transport sector parameters, then your conclusion is baked into the analysis. Higher target ambition would be the thing that stimulates BEV uptake. Lower ambitions in the LCFS would not stimulate as much. If you want to compare two different targets using the same uptake, then you need to invoke some other policy support to justify this. And this would have to be paid somehow. I guess I'm saying there may be a conceptual flaw in ignoring this feedback, the market feedback between the LCFS target and the decarbonization trajectory. Am I missing something?
So that is a very good question and a very complex one. So yes, making that assumption simplifies things, but it does overlook some behaviors that are likely to occur. So one of the things that you know I've come to conclude over many years of working in fuel policy space is that you probably don't want your fuel policy being the primary driver of the transition to new vehicles, because fuel policy, you know, it can sort of force the deployment of cleaner fuels, but it has to get the money to do this by adding charges onto some part of the fuel pool, typically the higher emitting fractions of it. And so, you know, if you're really using fuel policy as the primary mechanism to force a transition in the vehicle fleets, you're likely to run into some very regressive impacts. Functionally, you would end up having pricing some poor people out of the ability to drive, and that's not an acceptable mechanism for achieving these things. So really, you know, while I'm sure there is some response in the rate of EV uptake to credit prices, at least for passenger vehicles, which is, you know, most of the light duty vehicle sector and most of the transportation energy use in California, at least for the light duty vehicle sectors, we don't think there's a lot of sensitivity to the LCFS credit price, nor should there be. We think that it's policies like ACC2 that are really driving the fleet transition. And what the LCFS does is it makes that transition a lot more cost effective for the people who choose to act, particularly people who choose to act early on it, right? By getting in and benefiting from the support. We also think that the LCFS has a much stronger impact and is much better at driving the transition in the commercial vehicle space, where there's, you know, sort of bigger budgets, more ability to pass costs through, and more ability for you know, commercial shippers to find alternatives that match their needs. So I mean, yes, you're right that we do miss some of this feedback, and some of the price effects are baked into the transport transition model. Like one of the things that we see in the LCT runs out of TTM is because TTM looks at the cost of driving and sees significantly lower fuel and maintenance costs in EVs. It has you know, A, some increased driving activity by EV drivers, and B, people who drive more, it feels are going to go into EVs first, right? Because if you're driving a lot of miles per year, you're going to get a much larger impact off of the transition to an EV than somebody who doesn't drive many miles. And so some of that effect that Cato's talking about, I think, is captured by TTM. But you're right, some of it we're making the simplifying assumption and not doing it. But ultimately, I would be skeptical about using fuel policy to drive vehicle transitions. I think the fuel policy can be used to sort of incrementally find lower carbon versions of fuel within categories, and it makes the vehicle transition much more cost effective for the people who do it, which is a value in and of itself.
Okay. Next question is from Neil Kohler. This basically he has cited in the questions that have been answered by Wook in the online. He's citing some benefits for ethanol that aren't accounted for here, early E15, the degree of the CI benefit from CCS, and he's positing that this and other clean fuel developments will support a more aggressive trajectory than the modeling here is presented. Can you comment?
So I think it is certainly possible. We don't have great visibility on, if or when a transition to an E15 standard will happen, nor do we have great visibility on whether we'll have the emergence of, kind of mid-alcohol blends like the E20s and the E30s, which might allow for more efficient, higher compression engines. So there certainly are some potential benefits from higher use of ethanol that this model doesn't account for. Again, we didn't want to sort of assume the solution, but we can definitely put forward scenarios in which we sort of explore what would happen in those cases. Ultimately, though, we do have the our current model does have ethanol continue its long-term trend of broad carbon intensity reductions, as well as the introduction of some, very low carbon ethanol, whether that's cellulosic or corn plus CCS. We're sort of agnostic, but we do have, a few 100 million gallons of that entering the market by 2030. Even if we made all of the sort of most ethanol focused assumptions possible, it's hard to see it providing more, because it's in the current 2030 at a 30% target, ethanol is providing about 4 million credits. Even if we sort of, lean on all the levers to really build a scenario that absolutely maximizes the value of ethanol, it's hard to see it providing more than, an additional maybe 2 or 3 million credits above what we already have. And we are projecting more than 40 million deficits in 2030. So that helps. That could certainly, maybe support an extra percentage point or two of target ambition. But, I haven't yet seen a scenario in which you can get to a significantly more like a 5% higher target as a result. So we're certainly open, and we're happy to talk about running some of those additional scenarios.
Okay. I'm going to lump together a couple of EV questions here. One is from Steve Bloom, asking what's the fastest rate of battery electric vehicle adoption your model can handle? Thinking of Tony Seba's projection of near 100% adoption by 2028. And Doug Hooper also suggests that given the large proportion of ICE vehicles that remain in the market, would a sunset clause on ZEV crediting help to focus the market on switching from fossil gasoline and diesel to low carbon fuels?
So the trajectories for EV deployment were, those were developed by Lou and Marshall in the TTM modeling process. I'm sure they got a lot of input from Gil Tall and Scott Hardman and the other researchers at the EV Research Center here at ITS Davis. And, the Gil and his team have spent a lot of time working on figuring out what the maximum rate of EV deployment is. And the trajectory that's modeled in ACC2 is not, strictly speaking, the maximum possible trajectory that California could do. But it is basically the maximum we could do without having to more or less kind of like rob EVs from other states in the US. It's sort of, looks at the potential global and North American production of EVs and allocates them to the various states that have adopted ACC2 or similar EV policies. And so, there's not a lot of room to go. There's some room to go a bit faster, but there's not a lot of room to go that much faster, certainly not without doing it at the expense of other jurisdictions that are also trying to deploy EVs. And from a greenhouse gas standpoint, the deploying of EV in California, our grid is slightly cleaner, or no, our grid's a bit cleaner, so we get a bit more near-term greenhouse gas benefit. But at the end of the day, all jurisdictions have to go and move to EVs. So it doesn't really help for us to just kind of, outcompete and elbow out all the other states that are trying to do it. So, could we go somewhat higher if we had a somewhat faster EV deployment trajectory? Yes, we probably could. But the competition and the risk there is real. I don't see any way we could get to 100% EV sales by 2028, not unless California, again, outcompetes most of the rest of the US and probably other jurisdictions too, in order to get that many. It's going to take time to bring the rate of EV deployment is running into bottlenecks on the rate of EV manufacturing. And that's running into bottlenecks on the rate of battery manufacturing. And that's running into bottlenecks on the rate of critical material supply, particularly critical minerals. So, we're at the point where in order to relieve these bottlenecks, we're talking about having to be able to permit and construct mines for things like lithium and some of the elements needed in magnets more quickly. And even if we could do that, there's a long lag time between opening up the mineral supply, to opening up the battery production capacity, to opening up the EVs. And I have not yet seen a scenario that appears credible in which you can get to 100% EV sales by 2028. I would love to be persuaded otherwise, because our job gets a whole lot easier if that was possible, but I haven't yet seen that. I don't. It would require some significant recoding of the model to try to run that scenario through. If we see some scenarios make us believe it's possible, that's an area we certainly be interested in exploring. But at this point, it doesn't seem likely that you can get there by 2028. Could you get to 100% EV sales by 2032 or 33? Okay, that's where yes, California might be able to get there a little quicker. But to some extent, even once we get to 100% EV sales, the question on getting to 100% EV fleet is going to be, how do you get the last internal combustion engines out of the fleet? And the authority and regulatory requirements required to have California ban them from being driven in state, I don't know legally what the scenario that would allow that would be. It's getting into some really kind of questionable legal territory, I think. So I just don't know how much faster the transition can go, but I do know it can go a bit faster.
Okay, there are a couple of questions on lipid feedstocks and crop feedstocks. One is, if you were going to have a cap on lipid-based feedstocks, what would be the policy mechanism for implementing it? Would it be first come, first serve? Suppliers only receive partial credits, or some other method? And let me see who it was. There was another point that that basically spoke to the increase in food prices from crop feedstocks, and you're talking about cost burden. Wouldn't the cost burden also have to be accounted for on the food price side?
To answer the second question first, yeah, we're not trying to estimate food price impacts. Those would exist. I'm not the right person to try to do that particular modeling project. So completely right. We're just ducking that question. In terms of how you'd implement it, that's actually been on our wish list of things we wanted to try to model, and just haven't had the time or bandwidth to get into over the last couple of years of how you would implement a crop. And the person with the question is sort of on to a very important point, that a cap is not simple to implement in the structure of the LCFS. It can be done. My gut, again, without having modeled it through or spend a lot of time thinking about it directly, would probably be to proportionally issue credits to everybody who put it in. So if you get more than the cap coming in, then everybody's total allocation of credits goes down by some amount. I think trying to do the first in just leads to some really weird fluctuations in shipments and invoicing, and complicates the problem of storing those fuels that are imported in the first quarter but need to be held to the third quarter. So I think the proportional approach would probably do it. I mean, to be honest, a cap on feedstocks is a very blunt tool to trying to address a very complex problem. And ideally, I would rather adjust the ILUC adjustment factors, whether to just change the numbers or go to a sort of different modeling structure for the ILUC factors. But given the time frame we have and the need to make policy right now, we don't have models that I think are sufficiently precise on ILUC, particularly in the lipid space, where I think those approaches are really viable at the moment. So I think in absence of the ideal kind of more quantitatively focused solution, the simple blunt solution of a cap, at least provides the risk mitigation that we need, even if the quant and the scientist in me weeps at having to use the really blunt approach.
Okay, this is a question from Robin Bercruz. Reducing dependence on conventional petroleum-based fuels ultimately diminishes the significance of gasoline prices as a proxy for cost of driving, as consumers increasingly use other fuels. Flex fuel vehicles and ultimately PHEVs and E85 would seem to be something to consider, given that they also provide fuel optionality, virtual cost parity to ICEs, and for E85, sustained discount that gasoline. Have you looked at anything like that, given the concern for socioeconomic impacts and equity?
So, one of the reasons why we sort of looked at 2031 as a time to switch to the E15 standard is at that point you can increase the amount of ethanol in every gallon of gasoline, but you're not increasing the aggregate amount of ethanol California is consuming. And so, I think that at this point, the U.S. grain and sort of agricultural commodity market has adapted to a world in which we produce 15 billion gallons of ethanol. And so, there's a lot of efficiencies that have come out in the use of distillers grains and recovering corn oil. So I think, at this point, whether or not we should have ever made 15 billion gallons of ethanol, I think it's providing value, and it's certainly better than gasoline. And so preserving that value was one of the reasons why we wanted to have the amount of ethanol increase. And so by going to E15 early in the 2030s, we're able to kind of keep using roughly the same amount of ethanol moving forward, not grow that, but use it to push petroleum gasoline out quickly. Now, there are certainly a lot of other ways to do that, to more closely match the rate of gasoline decline. And there's also some potential growth for more ethanol without running into sustainability guidelines. So that's one of the things that we definitely can think about. It's difficult for us to model, the sort of specific penetration of E85 vehicles versus, mid-alcohol blends. The way FPSM handles it is we just sort of have ethanol as a fraction of gasoline on a volumetric basis. And we typically say that's 11% up through 2030 and 16% thereafter, that being the 10% and later 15 blended into gasoline, plus an additional 1% to represent the the small but non-trivial deployment of E85 and other high ethanol blends in California and elsewhere. So could definitely sort of vary that percentage up over time and find additional ways. And yes, I do think there are some opportunities to push petroleum out of the system quicker by taking kind of a more nuanced approach to the ethanol simulations.
Okay, circling back to Cato, do you anticipate possibility that fossil aviation will become regulated under the LCFS for interstate travel and generate deficits?
So we didn't include that in this particular one. We still have SAF as an opt-in fuel. Now, we are assuming that enough lipid-based SAF comes into California to fully satisfy California's intrastate aviation demand. So, that is sort of the I don't know how you phrase it, maybe like the highest potential outcome of fossil aviation being brought into the LCFS. We also do have a research project ongoing using the more sophisticated model that's under development, where we're trying to get some more granular and sophisticated answers to the question of what happens under different mechanisms of supporting SAF in California. So that's one where FPSM is not ideally suited in its current form to answer those questions in a sophisticated way. Like I said, we do have a full displacement of intrastate SAF as part of the assumption here, and we could analyze other scenarios around that, but mostly I think we're waiting for the more sophisticated model to be finished, and I think that'll give a better answer to those particular questions.
Okay, here's a quick administrative question. Will the recording as well as the slides be available?
Probably yes. We're going to listen to the recording and make sure that sound quality is good and everything's coherent. If it isn't, we'll probably go through and just record the presentation part and omit the Q&A. But yes, our plan is to host it. That's probably going to take a bit longer because we need to do some editing and polishing and then get it uploaded and hosted. But yes, we do plan to make the recording available as well on our website.
Okay, I'll just read the last 3 questions. We have about 6 minutes left, so if you have any more questions, put them in the Q&A box. In a comment to ARB, Tesla proposed increasing the EER for LDV EVs to 4 based on more recent studies of energy efficiency. Does this sound like a sensible change in the short term?
So, I'm not the right person to ask what the correct EER is. There are people who know the drivetrain. EER is complex because it includes not only the sort of fundamental engineering efficiency of the powertrain, but also driving activity, particularly for electric vehicles because they have regenerative braking. Whether you assume they're driving primarily in stop and go applications or in highway applications, that makes a pretty significant difference in the ultimate ratio of energy efficiency between internal combustion engine vehicles and EVs, and that's what the EER ultimately does. At a gut level, 4 sounds high to me, but I'm not, again, not the right person. But I do think we need to have a clear review of the EERs across the multiple vehicle categories, because I am fairly confident that the way the data we got from both the sort of measurement and also the early vehicle surveys from the late 2000s is not going to be representative of either the vehicles or the driving behavior today.
Okay, and a comment from Steve Bloom, just to note that sort of a ban, which we could do on strong public health grounds, at a certain point, not long after we reach 100% new BEV sales, the ICEV fuel distribution parts and repair system will start to collapse. There will be no long tail unless we inadvertently create one with the LCFS.
I mean, I suppose that's possible. That doesn't sound likely to me, because we do have to remember California is in a global sense one of the leaders in climate policy, and so we are going to be ahead of China and Norway are probably going to be ahead of us on the EV transition, but we might sort of be in third place. There are going to be a lot of jurisdictions that are significantly behind us that are going to keep the market for both fuels, petroleum fuels and petroleum fuel distribution and production functional for quite a while. So I don't think there's a likelihood that you're going to see a rapid collapse. Now you will see the sector shrink because demand's going to go down. How much and how fast, I don't know. A lot of that is going to depend on, to what extent do people really try to aggressively hold on to their ICE vehicles, again, for either ideological reasons or because maybe there are some situations where they provide more value, or to what extent do we, get ZEVs that can really meet all the duty cycle and lifestyle needs of California consumers. That really has yet to be determined.
Okay, I think that's all we have.
Okay, I do see one thing in the chat. I see one thing in the chat that is from Doug. The design in LCFS effectively requires gasoline diesel fuel users to subsidize ZEV users. The magnitude grows and increases over time, and given the large portion of vehicles in the market, would a sunset clause in ZEV? Oh, sorry, you already got that one. My apologies. I saw that. Okay, so yeah, and actually that's perfect because we're really at the end of our time. So thank you all for joining. Like I said, this is an area of exploration that we are absolutely going to keep pursuing. Though certainly we're going to be needing to find some additional resources to pursue it at the level of activity and investment we have in the past. But we are not walking away from this topic, and we're going to be here for a while. We absolutely want to hear from anybody who has data or suggestions that we can build into the model as we move forward. And like I said, I think, and I'm open to at least trying, if you can present us with scenarios of interest that rely on just changes to the control parameters that are in the slides that we're going to circulate and to the target trajectory. Those things I think we can very quickly turn around, publish on the website and put out in public. And so we'll see how well that works. And if there's 1,000 requests like that, then no, we can't do them all. But if a few people have some ideas, we're happy to do that. Look forward to the presentations coming out both as ITS reports and in your peer-reviewed journal of choice. And feel free to reach out, and thank you all. Thank you to Julie for helping with the moderation and the Q&A, as well as for co-leading the low carbon fuel research group here at UC Davis. Thank you to Jin Wook for presenting, and also definitely have to compliment him on the yeoman work he did. When I sort of built the first version of FPSM during the Driving to Zero report, it was largely just me, and so it was a bit chaotic and slapdash. There was a fair amount of spaghetti code and semi-legible notes inside, and he has taken that and done a really great job of turning into a coherent model with an actual internal structural logic and some documentation even. So thank you for that. We're certainly happy to keep evolving this tool. So with that, thank you and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.